I wanted to talk today about the mystery of color. Now, note that I'm not talking about color theory. We're not going to be talking about color theory today. Color theory, that term, refers to how we use colors in drawing and painting, right? The relationships between one hue and another, how we judge colors, sort of the psychological effects that we can get out of colors by using them differently, cultural associations with particular hues. All that stuff is very interesting and is usually the way that artists discuss color. But there's another level, and it's that other level that I want to talk about today in this video. A lot of artists might be unaware that there is actually a philosophy of color. And usually that philosophy of color discussion doesn't intersect at all with color theory, which I personally don't like. I wish that they would. I think that they're relevant to each other. And I think that both the academic philosophers who do the philosophy of color and the artists who engage color theory could do with sort of knowing more about each other. Before I started recording this talk, I went and checked on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy in its entry for the philosophy of color. I went and checked something that I've always had in mind, is painting or drawing or anything like our artistic side of things ever mentioned in that academic discussion. And maybe it is in the source material, but at least in an aggregator like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it is not. It never gets brought up, which I find that interesting because the artists are probably the people paying the closest attention to the nature of color moment to moment, even if their thoughts don't necessarily go towards the philosophy side. So yeah, let's try to bring the two worlds together. Now, there's a few things that I want to say up front here. One, as I've said in other videos of this kind, I'm not trying to convince you that what I am saying about this is true or that the particular position that I hold is true. I'm going to tell you my position, either as we go along talking or maybe I'll summarize it at the end. But I'm really not super interested in you being convinced of my view or thinking it's right for reasons that will become clear later. But what I'm interested in is just helping you open to the mystery. It's the mysterious quality that I think is the most interesting, the most useful. What I'm hoping you will get out of this discussion is just an invitation to not be so sure that you know what's going on here, to sort of knock loose a little bit the commonplace notion that we just get already what color is, how it is in the world, and that it really is sort of beneath our notice to ask these questions. So I hope that that's what you get out of it. So color theory, many of us will be familiar with it. We're not going to discuss that very much here. But what is the philosophy of color? Well, that is something like asking, what the hell is color and what is its status as a quality of objects? Now, there's no way to avoid it. We're going to have to go into a little bit of a detailed discussion about what a lot of those notions mean. When I say color, what do I mean by color? When I say equality, what do I mean by equality? And it's just unavoidable, but I want to make very clear that there is a real academic philosophical discourse around this, very educated people publishing papers and writing books about this stuff. And I am not an academic philosopher. So I am not going to sit around quoting those people or Descartes or Hume, who all have very interesting things to say about color. But if you are interested and you've never heard about this before, I would invite you to go look it up. Go dig into this. You may find it extremely fascinating. So I'm going to try to communicate it in common language. I don't have the knowledge necessary to allude to the lineage that there is of people carefully demarcating all of these quantifiers with language. And I also, that is a product of my ignorance for sure, but it's also, I don't think it's that useful to get caught up in that stuff, because I think that a lot of the philosophers of color are trying to prove something is true, which is not, as I said, what I'm necessarily trying to do here. I am trying to evoke an experience, and we don't need a bunch of citations to try to evoke an experience. So excuse me while I speak in a more commonplace way. So let's talk first about qualia, the qualia of color. So there's a common thought experiment about this that involves a hypothetical scientist, let's call her Susie, who works in a very advanced lab, and that lab is her whole world. In this magical lab, absolutely everything is black and white. There's no color. There's no color of any sort. Susie is black and white. Everything in the lab is black and white. She has computers and screens, and everything that comes through those computers and screens is black and white. And she has textbooks, and they're all in black and white. This lab is entirely devoted to the science of color. Let's say that it's specifically devoted to the science of the color red. Okay? And Susie is a very good scientist. In this lab, and with her devotion that she has to this study in her life, Susie can learn everything that could be said about red. So she learns how light sources interact with the surfaces of objects to create the spectral reflection that we interpret as red. She learns everything about the wavelengths that the eye interprets as red. She knows about its relationship to other wavelengths. She knows everything about what happens in the optic nerve, in the eye, in the brain, to produce the experience of red. Everything that could be said about red, Susie knows it deeply, is an expert of it. The punchline of the thought experiment, as classically presented, is if after 50 years of doing this, and Susie has mastered everything that could be said about red, if she steps outside of the lab for the first time ever in her life and sees a red object, will Susie learn anything about redness? In that moment, in that very first moment where she has for the first time ever seen the color red that she knows everything about but has never experienced, did she learn anything about red? Now, if you think she did learn something about redness, that aspect that she learned, the experiential quality of redness, is what is typically called qualia, the qualia of red, that experienced subjective flavor of that experience. We don't have to call it qualia. We could call it like redness as we see it, or something like that. But it's important that we have this distinction as we go into this conversation, because we're going to talk about redness as we see it, and then we're going to talk about something else, which is the properties of a red object that make us see it as red. And the discourse here, the debate, and there is vehement debate about this, is built on which is it? Which side is more important? How do they interact with each other? Where do you think color exists? What is the more important part of color? Is it the qualia? Is it the experienced redness? Is it the things about objects that make them appear red? Or is it some interaction of the two and we refuse to separate them? These are very, very interesting questions. And there are whole schools with, very cool academic names, that I can barely say that, it's like eliminativism. I've read that word so many times. I've never tried to pronounce it before. There's, I should have written these down or something if I was going to mention them, but like naive primitivism, that's another school of color philosophy. There's a very interesting sort of environmental philosophy of color, such that color can only be defined as the environment producing a color that is seen by an animal that must act on it. Like a fruit is red because it must lure this animal that will be attracted to the red fruit, eat it, and spread its seeds. Like it's really far out and very interesting, the things that people have proposed just about color, just about what colors are. Again, if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would highly encourage you to go look this stuff up and dive into it. But for our purposes here, I think what is most interesting is just that there is a debate at all. I think that we can almost end the discussion there. It's like, if you never knew there was a debate, if you never knew that there was very smart people out there who cannot agree on what the hell color is and where it happens, that might be enough for you from here. That might be the invitation that you need to sort of open to the mystery and go do your investigations. But if you don't want to close the video, if you want to stick around, let's tease it apart a little more. So here's something that I consider true about colors, which is that whatever happens in our eye, they are produced, language is so tough here. They are produced by things that occur on the surface of objects. So I see it from my investigation, from what I've learned. It's about molecular arrangements on the surface of objects that cause light that strikes them to reflect in a particular way. Now, if you've gone very deep into drawing and painting, you may have actually looked into this quite a bit in learning about things like specular reflection and diffuse reflection in trying to understand form. Very interesting things happen when a photon strikes an object. First off, it doesn't just like strike. Most photons will go into the surface of an object a little bit and do very complicated things in there. So they will bounce around within the surface of the object or deeper than just the surface, and then be emitted from the object after bouncing several times. And they can go in many directions. That produces what we call diffuse reflection, right? Because it's diffusing out in aggregate and on the average in every direction from each individual point. But some photons, even at those same points where diffuse reflection is happening, are also going to just not quite go in, and they're just basically going to bounce off and then exit at the same angle that they came in, and that's going to produce a specular reflection in the eye of the viewer. It's going to be a mirror-like reflection of the light source. And when you understand, and even that is a shorthand, what's actually going on when a photon hits the surface of an object is actually very, very scientifically complicated, more than I can understand when I've tried to read the real stuff, like people saying, all right, we're not going to simplify. This is what's, as far as we know, this is what's actually happening. I found my limit there. But in this simplified version, it's interesting how direct that relationship is. It's like if a photon hits an object and sort of lingers with it for a while, bounces within its surface before exiting, the more it bounces, the more it lingers. It's almost like you could say it becomes, that bit of light becomes more like what you associate that object to be by the time it gets to you, right? So if the object is red, the photon bounces around, red to you. The language here is tough. It bounces around, it leaves, it has this diffuse red quality by the time it gets to you because of that interaction. But if the photon only grazes the surface, if it just doesn't quite go in, but instead hits just once, bounces off, creates a specular reflection, it remains more like the light source. And that has interesting implications for us as painters, right? We then can know as a generalization that the specular reflection is always going to be more like the light source than it is like the object. And that's very easily seen with just some very light observation once you have first made contact with that insight. So the question then is, what does it mean to say that something is a particular color, right? So to simplify it in another way, the way that it's generally talked about is that, say you have a yellow banana, right? What does it mean that a banana is yellow? Well, scientifically speaking, let's say a white light hits a yellow banana. What is happening there is that the banana is absorbing all of the wavelengths of light other than yellow. And then it is releasing only yellow back out from its surface to your eye. Now you experience that banana as yellow because you got those leftover wavelengths of light. So what does that mean for what the color of an object is? It's clearly yellow to you. And I'm not saying it isn't, right? And if you and I stand next to each other, we're going to agree that the banana is yellow. And if we line up millions of other people, most people are generally going to agree it's yellow. We can sort of split hairs on what shade of yellow, what hue of yellow. Does it have a little bit of green in it? Does it have a little bit of orange in it? We can come back to that more nuanced conversation, but we'll generally agree that it's yellow. So where do you put the import? Is that what it means for the banana to be yellow? Is the banana yellow on its side of existence? Very, very interesting question as far as I'm concerned. Does the banana itself have yellowness? You see it as yellow because that's what it gave up. If you weren't there, and we're going to use language here that attributes a sort of almost like an agency and an essentialism to the banana that I don't really think is appropriate, but we're trapped using conventional language. If you weren't there, on the banana side of things, it's every color but yellow. Yellow is what it rejected. Now, therein comes the debate. There's many people who would say, no, it's yellow because that is what color is. It is the reflected spectral quality of what that object gives off. That is yellowness. And again, what we're discovering here with the philosophy of color is that people land in different places, and that I'm sure you'll see it in some of the comments for this video. And that'll be very interesting on its own, just for people to discover, like, oh, you don't agree? You don't see it this way? You think that objects sort of reflecting off this wavelength means that is the essential color quality of the object? Some people absolutely see it that way. Other people absolutely see it the opposite way. And they will have a lot of trouble intersecting. This is a profound and beautiful mystery as far as I'm concerned. So the banana rejects yellow in some sense, and it absorbs every other wavelength. If we try to attribute what I see as our common sense notion of what a color is, our common sense notion of a color, I would say, is not that it is the reflected wavelengths that objects are giving off, right? We all learn that when we're kids in science, but it is not at all our common sense notion, even after we have learned it, right? We consider colors to be the color of things. That is how they're colored. That is what they are. And in that sense, in that common sense way, no, I just don't think that maps to what is actually going on. If we apply our common sense notion of what we want a color to be, of what we emotionally want to get from color, that essential, delicious, really moving qualia of redness, of orangeness, of blueness, if we apply that to the science, everything gets all topsy-turvy. On the object side of things, every given object is every color but the one that you're seeing. In a sense, you have, even though all of this, everything that we see moment to moment seems so obvious, just so solid, if we run it through this lens of wondering, well, what is it all out there in the real world? And we'll return to that discussion. In a sense, what we have is a negative picture of the world. If you, I mean that almost literally in like a photography negative, or if you're more familiar with Photoshop, if you hit Command I to invert all of the colors in an image, you get this crazy, like what was light is dark, what was dark is light, all the colors are switched to their complements, and it's just a totally aberrant version of the image. If we ask ourselves what these things are out in the world, our color vision starts to look like that negative. It's not the inherent color nature of the things, it's what they shot back at us. Now, again, there's some people hearing this who are willing to go there with me. They just get sort of where my intuitions went at every little turn, and they're like, yeah, I see where Steve's coming from. Maybe I don't agree, but I see how he can kind of get there emotionally. And then there's other people who are going to be screaming and saying, you're just completely off. The only thing color could be is the light that is that light that they're rejecting, that they're sending to you. And I agree, right? Because again, if we cut off the part that they're sending to me, what is this, let's say, vacuum cleaner? I have a white vacuum cleaner. You can't see it. It's behind my camera, right? If I ask myself, what is actually, that's a bad example because white is sort of like the full spectrum. So let's imagine I had a red vacuum cleaner, right? So in the lens that I'm presenting, if I ask myself, what is the color nature of this red vacuum cleaner that in actuality is every color but red, there it immediately falls apart, right? Because there's no perception of this absorbed color spectrum, right? From that lens, I 100% agree that it doesn't make sense to say that we have this negative inverted image of the world, right? But as I said before, the common sense notion of what colors are, which is the main thing that I'm trying to, right? I'm not interested too much in the philosophy part, the actual, like what is out there, right? I'm interested in looking at what is the common sense? What do we carry around day to day? And just tweaking that a little bit so that we can get an unusual, interesting, heart-opening, connecting sense of freedom that kind of gives us a little bit of a creative surge, something. It's very difficult to put my finger on it, but like when this sense that things are not mundane, I think that sense, you can see that after a while as being more useful, in a sense, more normative, more real than the sort of very sad, dreary Monday morning mediocrity that our usual psychology can get into. And you can agree with my methods or not, but here we are. So this very quickly starts to ask questions about, what do we mean by the real world, this world before our perceptions, right? What is the nature of my living room when I'm not in it, right? Very, very classic little kid questions. If a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Yeah, we're back there. We're all the way back there at the core, at these very youthful questions. I don't know what my room is when I'm not in it. I don't. I won't pretend to know. But I am not an idealist, right? Now, idealism, hard idealism, is sort of this philosophical notion that there is nothing but mind, right? And in that definition, and there's wiggle room in definitions, I can't say I'm an idealist, right? I think that my vacuum cleaner, my camera, my water bottle, that I think that they are something outside of mind, right? That for me, that is the only thing that can explain their utter consistency, right? If I leave my water bottle there and I leave the room and I come back and I leave the room again and I come back and then I leave the room for a year and I come back in a year, my water bottle will be essentially the same. There's something structuring that consistency of its appearance. I believe that Andromeda, the Andromeda galaxy, exists in some sense, that mass is roiling around, the energy is occurring over there, that stars are exploding over there, even if you tell me there's not a single iota of conscious life in the entire Andromeda galaxy. So I'm not an idealist, right? I think that things do exist outside of mind. But I do think that you can only ever experience, by definition, you are only ever experiencing mind. That is all you will ever experience. In some sense, I think that is all that could be experienced. That's not to say that there can't be radically different kinds of minds, but it seems to me that unless we're talking about a mind that is totally different from our mind, such that probably we would need a different word for it, right? We'd be stretching the definition too much. Tabling those minds that are utterly, totally unrecognizable, just experiences that we can barely map to experience. Even before that, mind can be extremely different. We might imagine that our experience of ourselves, our mind is very different than the mind of an ant, right? But I think that sort of as an aggregate of a sensorium, we have that in common. We will have that in common, and that the mind can change very much and still be a sort of aggregation of inputs of a sensorium. And I think that, in a sense, that's the only way that whatever is will be experienced, can be experienced. That sort of defines experience. Everything needs to be lensed. Everything needs to be run through some kind of filter. Filter is not the right word, but all of experience, the rawness of things, whatever they might be outside of experience, needs to be, we're only ever going to touch them through this sensorium, see them through this lens, even if there's an infinite variety of them. So from that viewpoint, what is a rock on its own? What is a rock without any living creature perceiving it? I don't know, but from the stance that I just laid out, it's kind of infinite. Like a rock is an infinite number of things because it will arise, could potentially arise, in the only place we know things can arise, right? In experience, in the sense of there being something it's like to be us, to experience things. A rock can arise in experience in an infinite number of ways because there is an infinite variety of possible sensoriums that could interact with it. So I see a rock one way, but a bee sees it a completely other. I would think a bird might see it other. Think about how an ant sees a rock, right? Let's say I have a rock that's, about that I could hold it in the palm of my hand, right? I see it a very particular way, but is that the real seeing nature of a rock when to an ant, that same thing that I'm holding in my hand is a vast floor? It's the ground when that ant walks on it, and it sees this thing that I hold in my hand. The ant instead sees it as this far receding plane that it is going to traverse in the same way that I might traverse my neighborhood. I think that those differences there are not insignificant. I think that they do reveal something very interesting, that a rock, and then also the ant on it, and me looking at the ant, and anything, a pebble, a leaf, all these things, if they're anything, they are infinite. They can manifest in the world in a splendid variety of ways. And each instance of that is like real. It's like, that's it, baby, right? Like I can't look at the rock and not, my mind just tends toward over and over again. It just tends back towards, this is just its suchness, its nature. This is just what the rock is. And every creature that might interact with it, every lens, every viewpoint might have that same quality. Just bestowing upon this source material, this rock, that even to say that it is atoms, electrical fields, anything, the quasi-psychedelic things that are said about things when discussed in terms of quantum mechanics and physics, even to say those things does not actually allude in any profound sense to what the hell is the rock just on its own. Just on its own. Nobody knows, but we can make of it an infinite variety of things. This goes for basically everything about the rock, the way that it's felt, the way that it's seen, and yes, its color, right? So we're talking about color here, this mystery of color, but as with all these mysteries, you try to keep it narrow and it quickly just balloons out into just it's about everything. So to be clear, everything that I said is about everything about the rock, how much it seems to weigh to us, its general scale to us. You know, all of that are things that we impute on this raw source material that none of us will ever interact with. And yeah, now I'll just tell you sort of where I land on all this stuff. I think that is the case for the rock's color as well. I think that they're intimately linked, and I'm sure that this is a structured philosophical position within the philosophy of color, but I don't know what its name is, and I'm not really super interested in sort of labeling my beliefs here. But I think that the rock has qualities in that realm that we will never know, right? That realm that we will never know, that our common sense notion tells us is the real world, like the solid world, the continuous world, the world that is my living room when I'm not in it, right? The part of existence that remains consistent when no beings are experiencing that part of the world, right? That's what I'm getting at when I say the real world, right? In the real world, the rock has some aspect, right? A molecular arrangement to its surface that causes it, predisposes it to reflect light in such a way that when it interacts with this physiological, biological system, it is going to be experienced as blue. Now, if only it were that easy, right? If only I could leave it there, because wouldn't that be nice? Because as I said, I'm pretty sure that is a well attested to position within the philosophy of color. And that position, like all the other positions, has been attacked, rebutted, supported by other positions. And those positions, same thing. They've been supported, they've been attacked, they've been rebutted, right? If only it was that simple and we can just end it there. But there's another aspect here that really freaks me out and is really the thing that I think about most here. So as controversial as that might be to some people already, right? I think there's a deeper controversy within there. So the rock has these predispositional qualities, whatever they are, molecular, electromagnetic, the way that the very minute structure of its surface interacts with photons and sends them back out into the world. And then those very, very interesting scientific things also occur on my side, right? That wavelength of photons goes into my eye, as we've discussed in a previous talk. Then that produces, the cascade of phototransduction in my physiology, right? It strikes my rods and cones, interacts with them in a particular way. This begins a long sequence of changes to proteins and enzymes and things like this that crazily just eventually works its way up my optic nerve into my brain. And then here's the problem. All of that, even if you follow it in the greatest detail, And even if you ascribe a hard predisposition to the objects out in the world to reflect light in that way, once it gets up to your brain, once it gets up to that last step in the process, after all of that work, once it gets to the part where it says, all right, well, that then is, all that work is going to make these dendrites of neurons fire in this configuration, whatever that is, a process, a particular shape, whatever it is, interact with each other. That final punchline still isn't red or blue or green or yellow or the gray color of the rock. That final punchline and everything that came before it, the changes in the membrane potentials of proteins in my optic nerve, the rods and cones sort of having their surfaces affected, the wavelengths entering my eye, the particular molecular arrangement on the surface of the stone, none of that is red. It's not the qualia of red, as we discussed at the beginning. Where the hell does that particular flavor come from? I have no answer for that. And a lot of people listening to this will just not see that there is a leap of interest there. There's, having been around discussions like this for a while, there's just diverging intuitions here. Some people won't see that there is a disconnect between the shape of that neuronal firing and redness. And I don't know what to say to them. I just have different intuitions. And I'm not the only one who has those kinds of intuitions. It's clear to me in a way that I can't really explain that the shapes, configurations, processes of all of the scientific facts that produce that qualia are not that qualia. It's clear to me that there is a leap from the shape of that that final neuronal firing to what I experience as redness. And I don't know how I could convince you that leap is there if it isn't, but maybe you can just take it on faith that I'm not lying to you, that in this person, it's clear that there is a leap. Now, this then leads me to, if you can't make that leap with me, everything that I'm about to say is probably going to be lost with you. But it's one of the points of me doing these talks like this is that I'm just trying to just get out of cryptic territory and just tell you, at least here to summarize on the tail end of this conversation, sort of what interests me about it and where's my learning edge on these things, right? So what I want, the questions that freak me out are the hues that we see arbitrary? What do I mean by that? So it's a common childhood question. Maybe you haven't asked it, but a lot of people have. I think especially if you're an artist, you've probably asked this. You imagine your friend standing next to you and you're looking at the sky and you say, and you discuss with your friend, or you think about it, you say, the sky is blue. I see it as blue. And I would say to my friend, the sky is blue. And my friend would say, yes, the sky is blue. But what if what I see as blue is what my friend sees as red? And there's really no way that we could ever communicate this to each other, right? There's no real way that we could ever prove that we're both seeing the same blue, that our words are not confused in some sense. Maybe every person is actually seeing a completely different rainbow, or the hues are swapped, right? And we move on from this. We asked this a couple times as kids, and then we realized there's really, it's a lockup, and how far can we go with it? Now, I personally don't feel that if a human is standing next to me, that my blue is their red. I think that's a bit far. I feel like the facts of how similarly our minds, our eyes, all of this are arranged is enough to let me just, I don't have any problem with it. I can just accept that. Yeah, I feel like how my mom sees blue is how I see blue. We're seeing the same qualia, right? But once we get off of people, once I start asking questions about how are birds seeing these same qualia, how are aliens seeing these same qualia, things start to fall apart for me a little bit. The core question is almost, for anything that has an eye, right? So birds have eyes, different from ours, but an eye. Bees have eyes, quite different from ours, but eyes. And maybe aliens have eyes, right? And they'll probably be quite different from ours, but eyes. Do you think, let's go to the alien, just gets very far out. Do you think that if aliens had eyes, even if they're very different, do you think that, let's say if they look at a tree, let's say that they're about the same size as us, there's no big scale differences, right? Do you think if they look at a tree, if they look at the leaves of a tree, do you think that the same photon wavelengths, right? The same light wavelengths that go into my eye in the human physiological system and create the qualia of green, do you think it must be the case that if that same wavelength of light enters an alien eye, that they must see the same qualia of green? Do you think that? My gut tells me no. I can't fathom what would make it such that they must be seeing the same qualia of green as I do. Now, again, people might disagree with me there. There's probably people listening to this who would say, yes, even a very far out, even a very different alien would see the same green that I see when looking at a tree, even if they have a very different kind of eye, brain system, optic nerve. Can you even say they have nerves? There's going to be some people who think that. I can't get there in my head at all. I can't agree with them. I don't share any of those same intuitions. My gut tells me that there's absolutely a way. Because that leap is so clear to me, I just feel it in my guts. I could feel it that a suitably different alien with a suitably different eye, those same electrical wavelengths, those same electromagnetic wavelengths that we experience as photons, those wavelengths of light entering their eye, even if it's the same as the ones that are going into mine, could produce a qualia that is different than the green that I experience, than the green that you see when you look at that plant behind me. Now, I'm not saying that it would be a qualia like red or purple, right? I'm saying it could be anything else. And that's what I mean by that question that drives me crazy. Are the hues that we see as a human species utterly arbitrary? Because I can see when I run the thought experiment with the alien that it could be any arbitrary qualia. I'm not saying that we as humans don't have consensus on our qualia. Like I said, I think that you and I are probably seeing the same blue. But damn it if I don't think that qualia of blue is probably completely arbitrary. There is probably, again, now we're just in my feelings, right? There is probably on the table an infinite spectrum of color qualia across species, across eyes, across neurobiologies. And again, we get back to this awe-inspiring sense that even the littlest thing in the cosmos, just a fleck of dust, a pebble, a grain of sand, is, when seen this way, just a fountain of infinity, utterly undefinable, ready to be transformed into anything by whatever might come along that summons it into experience. And that's just it being summoned into experience in an infinite number of ways. who knows what the hell it is on its own? What is it when it's not being experienced? On that, I truly have no comment. I really don't know. I have no intuitions there. I think science can tell us some astute things about that state, but I just see it as a perfect divide, just unknowable. Moo. And I don't find that a scary unknowing. As everything that I talk about here, I find that to be a liberating, freeing, exciting unknowing. It shakes me loose from feeling like everything's very small, very miserable, very straight down the barrel. That's a good sense to have, I think. So, this discussion, again, which is long debated, people can't agree at all on any part of it, right? They can't agree on the final positions that people hold. They can't even agree on just the semantics of it, right? No one can quite agree on, all right, well, when I say color, what do I mean and what do you mean by color? And if they try to tease it out, they find they're not even, when each person says color, they don't even mean the same thing, right? People can't agree. If I say color, do you mean color as we experience it? Do you mean red as we experience it? Or are we talking about a presumed dispositional quality of objects? Is that color? And then both sides not just can they not agree, but then they'll say the other one doesn't exist. They'll say, well, the dispositional quality of the object is not something that is ever experienced. All that is ever experienced is the qualia of the color. And then other people will say the supposed quality of the color, the supposed qualia of the color is the dispositional quality of the object. And I don't know, if you find that compelling, you should go to a great college, get a philosophy degree. But it's interesting to me how much that opens even the most core assumptions that we have about how we see the world and what the world is. And given that it's color, I think that stuff is fascinating for artists. I will say as a final note on the academic stuff that I have, the stuff, I haven't gone super deep into it, but the stuff that I have looked into, there's a lot of hand waving in most of the positions about colors being sort of what is known or said to be a color to normal observers under normal conditions, right? And they sort of, the philosophers and the scientists who investigate this stuff don't really want to talk about unusual observers and unusual conditions. So, for example, they don't want to talk about like the fact that red objects can be perceived to be red under blue lights, right? Or many mixed light sources, right? They want to deal with these notions sort of assuming a perfect white light in a sterile room and a very flatly colored red ball or something like that. And there's, as I said, a sort of hand waving there where they say that the confusions that would come from adding in these other confounding factors, the colored light sources, the various colors on the ball, the real world dither that actual objects have, is sort of insignificant. And I think nothing could be farther from the truth. I think it is clearly significant. And it is that significance that is what artists deal with all the time when they work with color, right? So let's say that I had a red apple. Everybody agrees that's a red apple, right? And we put it on a table, we put a white light on it. Everyone's like, that's a red apple. It's a red apple with a white light on it. Now I pull a painter out of the audience and I say, go ahead and paint it. Some great, let's say it's Monet or something like that, or Child Hassam or something like that. I say, paint the red apple. They're going to paint the apple with all sorts of colors that are not red, and it'll still be experienced as an apple by the viewer. Interestingly, if I gave the painter only one red hue, only one red paint tube, and black and white to do value differences, even though they're painting with red, let's say they push the painting as far as it will go, any conventional viewer will look at that apple and say, it's not quite right. It's a red apple, right? But I painted it with red. Isn't red all I need? No. In actuality, if you're actually trying to present the experienced color nature of any given object, painters with experience know you need to vary the hue constantly. A red apple will have green in it, yellow in it, orange in it, spots of neutral colors, grays, browns, things that are not red. And in fact, to be limited to red, even though that's the primary color of the apple, would create an unnatural looking apple. It would seem strongly cast into the stylization of monochrome. And this is fascinating to me, that the philosophy of color does not really pay attention to this, or simply is not ready to tackle those questions. There's parts that do. There are parts of the philosophy of color, people who have written about it, who do basically in a disclaimer sort of way say that there actually is no arbitrary, or there is no insignificant way to dismiss these concerns, and that to say this is red, this is yellow, this is green under ideal lighting conditions is actually a highly arbitrary lens. But then they have to leave it there, and then they need to go play in that conventional language of the arbitrary. And I just think that there is so much that's missed here. Another interesting question for me, let's say that we have the red apple again. Now let's say that I paint the apple, I don't make a painting of it, but I literally, the physical apple, let's say I take blue paint that is perfectly opaque and adheres perfectly to apples, which might be hard to find, but let's imagine a hypothetical paint. Let's imagine I paint the entire apple blue, the whole body of the apple and the stem of the apple. Let's say I paint it blue and put it back on the table. Is it still an apple? How essential is the redness of an apple, of a red apple? Forget that apples can be green, right? We're not talking about that. Let's look at the group of red apples. How essential is the redness of the apple to the nature of the apple? I think that your gut answer to that question actually reveals a lot about your philosophical inclinations. A lot of people just say it's an uninteresting question, right? But how do you view it? What does your brain tell you is going on there? Has nothing changed? Is it still an apple? Is it still a red apple, even though no red is visible, even though now it's covered in blue paint? Do you intuitively feel instead that it's what are you seeing experientially? When you look at that apple on the table covered in blue paint, what are you seeing experientially? Are you seeing blue paint that is shaped like an apple? Or are you seeing an apple covered in blue paint? Now, again, I know what it actually is. I know it actually is a red apple that I covered in blue paint. But experientially, in the moment, before narrative, before memory, before history, what are you seeing in terms of phenomena in that moment? Are you seeing a red apple covered in blue paint, or are you seeing blue paint shaped like an apple? Again, diverging intuitions there, I understand. Some people will say, this is not interesting. This is a deep study in uninteresting questions. And I don't know what to say to them other than I find those questions very interesting as an artist, as a painter. This leads me into sort of the philosophy of the elimination of color, which is actually one of the things that makes me return to drawing in pencil. For my personal practice, my favorite thing about my practice is working in pencil. And that is not a mystery to me that I love that. And it's not accidental. I know why I love it. This is why. Hold on. I need to take a deep breath before I reveal secret birds that live inside of my chest. There is a magical quality to removing color from form. In the real world, you never see form without color, right? Every form comes with a color. White objects are not purely white. They still always, if you open up, if you let your eye rest, there is almost always gradation. It's not perfectly flat. And in any view of a non-perfectly flat thing, the mind and the eye work together to impinge at least temperature differences between different parts, between different values. So there's, even though it's ever so subtle, there's parts that are going to be slightly warmer, slightly cooler. The philosophy of warm and cool is very interesting as well, because there's actually been studies done sort of trying to put into a hierarchy the way that language is created to differentiate colors. And there's interesting evidence that the first differentiation that is made in language is warm and cool colors before you even name hues. How fascinating is that? Again, look into this stuff if you're interested. But so in the real world, you never ever see form separate from color. A drawing is a magical thing. A graphite drawing is a magical thing because it allows you to see the world through this elimination of color in an utterly magical way, a way that you can never see it otherwise. It's just form with color evened out. You know, it's gray, sure, and it's still in our visual field. So as I said, because it's in our visual field, even though it's the same graphite going down everywhere, our mind will create a flicker of warm and cool, ever so subtle, but it is there. It's just something that our brain does. But on the conceptual level of the drawing itself, there is no color, right? It's just a monochrome lens. I find that fascinating. You know, I find it, you know, the idea that you can take a Coca-Cola can, which is deeply, intimately linked with the idea of redness to just about everybody, right? But I can draw a can of Coca-Cola with the graphic and logo and everything in black and white, and your mind will still read it as, that's a Coca-Cola can, just because of everything else, the local value, the reflections, all of this, the form, right? That's very interesting to me. Not interesting to others. It's interesting enough to me to keep me returning to pencil over and over and over again. So there's a little gateway there to the philosophy of the removal of color. You know, that could be very interesting on its own as well. So again, I've been going for a while here, so I think I'm going to wrap it up. But just to summarize my hope here, I hope that this just shakes you loose of the common sense notion of how we deal with color day to day on a philosophical level, on an experiential level. I would hope that this would just give you at least a moment of just not being quite so sure that everything is exactly as it seems, you know? Maybe you can take it on a walk with you. Walk around your neighborhood, and as you pass a green bush, you know, which is it's green, but it's the painter's green, right? It's this particular green under this particular light, seen from this particular viewpoint, right? And if you analyze, it's like that green that you just take the bush to be, this greenness that you assign it, this paradigm of greenness is actually composed of the cooler green that is reflected by the waxy top of a leaf, as opposed to the warmer green that is seen on the underside of a leaf where light has diffused through it and lost some of the cool color spectrum up at the top of the leaf. It's a flickering aggregate of warmer, cooler, of more yellow, more green, more warm, you know, deep in the heart of the bush. There will be very warm, dark accents that don't feel very green at all. They'll feel almost red, you know, in that darkness. Look at that, observe that, marvel at that as you walk around. And that's the painter's eye. But then perhaps also invite in this deeper questioning. Ask yourself, where does this color reside in the bush? Does this color just reside in me? It has to do with me. It's very hard to hold a position that says it has nothing to do with me. Whatever you're experiencing, your mind is generating it. You can't experience things outside of mind. It's got to have something to do with you. Where does this color reside then? Is it only in me? Is this color somewhere in the bush? If it's in the bush, what does that mean? What does it mean that the bush has greenness? Does that just come down to a molecular arrangement on the surface of the form, is that greenness? Is a molecular arrangement what I mean by green? Is it possible that I'm just getting what the bush rejects? Is the bush everything but green from my common sense notion of color? Even just me talking about it here, I'm not even out looking at a bush. I'm just like, I don't know. I just feel a lovely openness that you really can't put a price on. You really can't. So I'd be interested to see. I think it's inevitable if people pay attention to this at all. I think it'll be interesting. It's always interesting for me, but I think also especially for people who have never looked at it from this viewpoint before, it'll be interesting for them to see how vehemently people disagree on various different points of this discussion. It's fascinating how much people can disagree on a ground floor experience, like just the consensus view of color. And the consensus view, we didn't even talk about colorblind people. What does it mean that some people can't see certain hues, or they see what we see as a certain hue for real, sort of in line with that childhood question of, do they see blue as I see red? Colorblind people see the hue that you see one way, a different way. You know, what does it mean that a colorblind person who's red-green colorblind doesn't see red? In whose experience? They've never seen it. Is something actually missing there? I think this is actually interesting to ask. A colorblind person is sort of only, the sense of impoverishment there is really instantiated by those of us who we hold the consensus view. We say, well, this is the qualia of red. Shame you can't see it. We instantiate that sense that they're off, right? They as far as they're concerned, they have a complete sensorium. And many colorblind people have these wonderful stories, I find them wonderful, of the day they realized they were colorblind, the day they learned they were colorblind. It freaks me out thinking that there were days, a whole unbroken period of their life where they didn't know. What does it mean to introduce that knowledge into someone's life? What does it mean about color that they did not know? That it's possible they could have gone their whole lives without knowing had no one run a color blindness test on them. I don't think these things are uninteresting or insignificant. I think these things are very, very, there are deep mysteries hidden inside there. Deep mysteries hidden inside there. That'd be another thing I'd be interested in hearing about too. If there's any colorblind people out there, your experiences of discovering your colorblindness, and do you have any thoughts on the idea that you are sort of labeled blind by the consensus reality, by the consensus view of color vision, and the fact that people will deploy those particular colors in particular ways? How does it feel to you that you are sort of labeled blind in that sense? Those of us who have what is considered normal consensus color vision, what colors are we blind to that we do not yet know? You know, there are people, forget other species, there are people who, I believe instead of having triadic vision, they are called tetrads. They have an extra little something. This needs more research, but that technically opens the range of color they can see. What's the consensus there? Okay. We've opened perhaps more doors than we have closed. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the world of color that you experience.